Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Tristan Hughes. Tristan is a producer and presenter for History Hit Channel, and that bills itself as the world's best history channel on demand. And actually, I think that's fair enough. And for those of you who don't know about it, this is a really fantastic history website giving access to hundreds of articles, TV-style documentaries and podcasts, and I don't think there's anything out there quite like it. Certainly not for sheer quality and depth. So if you haven't seen it, I really, really recommend checking it out, and of course I'll put a link in the show notes. And as well as being one of the History Hit team, Tristan is also an author, and it's his book, The Perdiccas Years, that we're going to talk about today. So welcome, Tristan, to the podcast.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you for your kind words about myself and about History Hit in general, as you say. So very excited to be here and to talk Perdiccas, perhaps a bit about History Hit too.
Great, yes, please do. So we're going to talk about Perdiccas, and he's one of Alexander the Great's most trusted commanders. And so maybe before we talk about Perdiccas, maybe we should talk about Alexander. And at the time we're talking about Alexander, he and his army, they've defeated the Persians, they've conquered their empire, and Alexander's gone way beyond that. He's conquered most of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, and he's reached all the way to India, where he finally decides, or maybe he's persuaded by the army, to turn back. And so we can set the scene. Alexander is safely back in Babylon in the year 323. He's able to rest, he's able to recuperate, and plan his next move. So tell us, Tristan, what does Alexander do next?
Well, as you say there, Russell, he's back in Babylon, this new centre of his new great post-Persian empire that he has there. He has with him his royal army, which by that point probably numbers almost, or if not over 100,000 soldiers. His veteran Macedonians, many of which had served with him since the start of his campaigns. Lots of various Asian contingents of soldiers too, some very stellar units like his Macedonian-equipped, Macedonian-styled Epigoni, 30,000 of these Persian youths trained in the Macedonian manner. Many other Asian soldiers too, cavalry, infantry, javelinmen, archers, horse archers, elephants too. He's got, by this point, I think it's fair to say, his main wife, Roxana, the Bactrian, or more likely the Sogdian princess, who Alexander married during his campaigns to solidify his control of that northeastern region of what is his empire in modern-day Uzbekistan. He also has there his half-brother, his elder half-brother, Aridaeus, who I wanted to mention him now because he's important in the story that follows Alexander's demise that we're going to get into. Aridaeus, who I would just highlight now, we don't know what condition he had, but he did have some sort of mental deficiency, which meant that he was incapable of ruling without aid. And so Alexander, he's a very notorious figure, Alexander the Great, and he has in the past assassinated, removed family members who he saw as a threat to his rule. He doesn't see that with the case of Aridaeus. He seems to kind of liked the guy. So actually he is with Alexander and his army there too. So that's the scene. Alexander's there with his army, his generals, his wife, who's then 8 months pregnant, his elder brother. Just a few figures I want to highlight straight away. And as you hinted at there, Russell, he's back in Babylon and he's planning his next moves. Consolidation doesn't really seem to be a word associated with Alexander himself. That's something for perhaps his satraps, for his governors that he's stationed all around his empire at this time, which, as you mentioned, theoretically stretches from northwestern Greece to the Indus River Valley. Alexander is looking at new places. He is looking at the Arabian coastline. He's already sent a naval expedition to scout the coastline of Arabia and perhaps its access to trade routes and so on. So he's looking at going down there in the near future. And I personally think he is also very much eyeing up a return to the west, particularly looking at the city-state of Athens, which was becoming more and more troublesome in that time, just before Alexander's demise in mid-323 BC. It was on a bit of a resurgence, and anti-Macedonian figures were very much starting to seize power in this city-state. And Alexander is starting to, well, he's already ordered the construction of a massive new fleet in the eastern Mediterranean, some 1,000 ships, if I remember correctly. So he's potentially also looking west too. So Alexander, he's back, and he's looking for more conquest at the age of 32. in 323 BC in Babylon.
And it's astonishing, isn't it? I mean, he is only 32. I mean, this is insane. When you think about the Romans tried to conquer the Persian Empire, for centuries and centuries and centuries, and he knocks it over in, under 10 years. It's just an astonishing achievement.
Well, of course, the Persian Empire that the Romans face is a different Persian Empire to the one that Alexander faces. You have the Parthians and the Sasanians with the Romans, and it's a different kettle of fish completely. But as you say, it is still an incredible achievement because, make no mistake, the Persian Empire at the time of Alexander the Great, it was the superpower of the ancient world. It had an incredible bureaucratic system. We have known for the Persepolis fortification texts. Obviously, it had this deeply prestigious history, and the origins of the Persians is fascinating, how they rise in the first place to such a dominant position on the Iranian plateau and then spread out to Europe, to ancient Thrace and northwest Turkey today, all the way to places like Samarkand and Uzbekistan and so on. And as you say, Alexander, he conquers it through a series of battles, but also his campaigning, his ability to maintain certain aspects of the Persian administration, retain certain Persian officials who submit to him, and also obviously through brutal and bloody conquest too. It is astonishing how quickly he is able to do it, but at the same time, it's also one of those things which I think adds to the allure of Alexander. This figure who is so young when he dies. People say, he never lost a battle. Well, there are a few occasions where his subordinates lose battles and actually where he is forced to retreat. But maybe that's once again the allure of Alexander, the fact that he does die so young and he does achieve so much, it seems, in such a short period of time. He's only ruling for 14, 13 years, the Macedonian throne. And it adds to his mythologizing in the years ahead. In the medieval period, stories of Alexander, these Arthurian mythical tales of Alexander. Some versions see him go to the bottom of the sea in a submarine, and others see him go on a flying contraption. All of these myths come around this figure who's idolized by those immediately following him, those who served with him. Then obviously the Romans, many Romans admire him, and then the Byzantines, and then in the medieval period too. He is such an astonishing figure and achieves so much. That's one of the great things to remember about Alexander. He seems to achieve so much in such a small period of time.
And it's funny, isn't it? Probably today he's reached the point where he's at his least admired because Alexander the Great. And people say, well, if we look at his record as a conqueror, as a destroyer, maybe great is not the word. I don't quite know. How do you get to be called the Great? Who sort of fixes that to the end of your name? You get Pompey the Great, you get Alexander the Great, Peter the Great. I don't know who. Is there a list?
I don't know. I don't know when the Great starts. Obviously, as you're quite right to point out there, Alexander, he's a megalomaniac. He is a very infamous figure, but he's still very much seen as an extraordinary figure today. He's infamous and extraordinary, and we shouldn't forget that other side of Alexander. For instance, during his Indian campaign, where he basically commits genocide against lots of various Indian societies down the Indus River Valley, particularly after his attacking of the Brahmin caste. And his, in my opinion at least, his misunderstanding of the importance of Brahmins in those Indian societies and how that actually leads to a lot of resistance building up against Alexander throughout that. But he's a brutal, brutal man. He's flexible as well. You'll also see it with his successors like Perdiccas and the rest. Sometimes they can be absolutely brutal and show no mercy to particular figures. Other times they can show clemency. It's all about this more flexible style of leadership. But in the case of the Great, there are so many figures from ancient history who, when they label themselves the Great, it's never a good sign. I don't think Alexander labelled himself the Great, but let's talk about someone like Antiochus III, who was a Seleucid ruler, a Hellenistic ruler later. I'm pretty sure he is labelled the Great in his own lifetime by his own people, and his record isn't very good by the end. So actually, it's not. It's a bit of a kind of a misnomer, at least in my opinion. I'm sure there'll be those who disagree, but I don't know when the Great comes up. But you're right to highlight that there is this infamous... Alexander is an infamous figure. He is a megalomaniac by the time of his demise in 323 BC.
So I guess that's what he does next. He doesn't go off to attack Carthage if Carthage exists. He doesn't go and explore the Arabian Peninsula because his next move is... Do we know why he dies? What he dies of?
That is the great question. Well, I think it's almost certainly that he dies of a combination of factors, but I think the one thing that I would, and I'll come back to, so I'll explain at the end, but if you've seen the 2004 film, Oliver Stone's film Alexander, there is very much a hint that Alexander is poisoned by his subordinates who worry that he's getting too powerful or just wanted to conquer and conquer and conquer. That's almost certainly a fiction, a later fabrication added to his story, this idea that a family desired to poison Alexander and did so. In regards to Alexander's final days, we have two very similar accounts surviving from Arrian of Nicomedia and Plutarch of Chaeronea, who are both writing during the Roman imperial period, but are using as their source this very interesting source called the Royal Journals, the Ephemerides, which were, we believe, probably written by Alexander's personal secretary, Eumenes of Cardia, which document the last week and a half, 2 weeks of Alexander's life. And they mention how Alexander goes to a drinking party, then he starts developing a fever the next day. Condition worsens over the following days. He's ultimately consigned to his deathbed. He then becomes mute in the days before his ultimate death. The soldiers then file past his bed in a very emotive, poignant scene as they desire to see Alexander one last time, and they bid their farewells, and Alexander gives them some sort of nod, some mute gesture of acknowledgement of their presence for one final time. And then he dies on the 11th of June, 323 BC. What he dies of, malaria, typhoid, pneumonia have all been proposed as potential causes of his death. Various papers have been put forward on this. One theory is even that actually he didn't die on the 11th of June and actually entered a catatonic state and would actually die in the following days when he's embalmed. So he would die sooner or later regardless. But there could be other factors too, which I'm quite enamoured by. This idea that his heavy drinking, which was a key part of the culture that occurred throughout his life, this heavy dinner boozing contributed to his illness and his early death. And also the multiple war wounds which he suffered over the course of his career, some very severe, some less severe, but severe ones include him getting hit on the shoulder and the neck with a catapult bolt while sieging I think it was the city of Syropolis in modern-day Uzbekistan. His lung being punctured by an arrow whilst he's fighting down the Indus River Valley. I think all of that contributes, and potentially there's also an element of grief there too, because Alexander had lost his closest companion, I've been inspired to say his lover Hephaestion the previous year too. So all of those factors may well have combined with the disease, with the fever, for Alexander's early death in June.
And it is astonishing, isn't it? You talk about his war wounds. It just seems absolutely bonkers to us. He's right there at the front of the front line every time, even when it's some miserable little town that's being besieged. It's not just the big battles. He's there at the front every time. It just seems nuts.
And I think this is an important point to stress straight away, because it also applies to Alexander's subordinates who comes to the fore following Alexander's death. Alexander has this incredibly charismatic aura, which means he has this incredible respect and is able to inspire his soldiers unlike anyone else of the time. In the fact that, as you say, he leads from the front, he dices with death time and time and time again. He shares in the risks of his soldiers, and they love him for it. Hence why they are willing to follow him so far, because he is willing to share in these risks. He's not leading from the back, he is leading from the front. And this is also important when talking about Alexander's lieutenants, his generals, which come to the fore following his death, because I always love to think of them. Perdiccas, Craterus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Python, all these people no doubt we'll talk about as mini Alexanders. Because when Alexander is leading the line, like at the critical part of the battle where he is leading his companion, cavalry or his foot guard, to deal the decisive blow against the enemy, or leading against a ladder, running up a ladder during a siege or something like that, his other generals, Alexander has massive confidence in them to lead from the front in their other positions in the line, and to similarly inspire those around them. So whilst, for example, Alexander is leading his companion cavalry during the decisive Battle of Gaugamela against the Persian king Darius III in 331 BC, Perdiccas is leading his battalion of soldiers in the centre. He is fighting with his men in the centre. He is inspiring his particular battalion. Craterus is doing the same. Parmenion on the left is doing the same. They are all fighting in the front line with their soldiers. Perdiccas even suffers a wound during that battle of the Gaugamela, and it once again emphasises how these generals, although they couldn't match the overarching aura, inspiration, charisma of Alexander, they were of a similar mould. they likewise fought from the front. They diced with death, and as of such, they gained a respect amongst the soldiers that few in the ancient world at the time could rival.
It is interesting, though, because you compare them to the Romans, and Caesar, he's never in the front line unless things have got really, really, really bad.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think, is it Scipio Africanus who says, my mother, I was born a general, not a soldier, or something like that? It's one of the Scipios who says that, and hence why he's leading from the back. He's from the back, he's overseeing it. And that's very, I'm not like I'm not like an armchair military historian or anything like that. I love the military side of things, but this is a very understandable way for why that's the case. And it's a Julius Caesar, he does fight with his men, at times, Alesia and so on. But as you say, only when the situation is very desperate. So the generals of Alexander, they are on this remarkable mode of leading from the front, which continues following Alexander's death, and they continue to lead from the front. It also means, as you do see in this post-Alexander period, that not always do these risks pay off. Alexander the Great is in many ways very lucky to live as long as he did, because he survives these real near misses with death. And I won't spoil it too much, but it's another figure like Leonnatus. He tries something similar in the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death. He leads a cavalry charge. He's butchered. He's butchered straight away. He'd survived the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and he's butchered when he's trying to emulate it following Alexander's death. So we see it time and time again, this leading from the front with these people who succeed, but whether they are able to match it, that's another question entirely.
So we've got to the death. We haven't got too far into the story, but Alexander has now died. We're not quite sure what of, but he's died, and so presumably he's now set out an orderly and well thought through succession plan, which is rolled into place. Is that about right?
Yeah. If only Russell. The book would have been much, much simpler if that was the case. Alexander dies without a clear heir. And I could go into a lot of detail about the chaos that ensues, but I'll try to wrap it up relatively quickly. And this also brings back those figures who I mentioned earlier, Alexander the Great's elder half-brother Aridaeus, and the fact that his wife was then 8 months pregnant, Roxana. So that's important. But Alexander has no legitimate son at the time of his death. He has no legitimate daughter either, but back then it was the son who would become the new king, who would become the successor. There is no clear heir where Alexander dies, and the only indication Alexander gives is in a couple of our sources, and I believe it's true. He hands his signet ring or some sign of authority to Perdiccas, who is the leading subordinate of Alexander the Great in Babylon at that time, basically telling Perdiccas, it's your job to oversee the succession of what happens next. And what follows is an attempted conclave between Alexander's highest subordinates, Perdiccas, Ptolemy, his other bodyguards, his leading generals, people like Python, Lysimachus, Pusestus, his personal secretary, Eumenes of Cardia, and so on. And almost think of it maybe almost like a papal conclave. They gather in a room in the palace, and they're going to decide what's going to happen next, how they're going to solve this crisis. And you have this horde of Macedonian soldiers in the courtyard of the royal palace, impatiently waiting to hear what's going to happen next. But their impatience gets the better of them, and they burst into the room where this conclave is happening, and they demand to be part of the process. Because they're mercenaries, really, by now. They gave up everything to serve with Alexander, to go with him to the edges of the known world and back. Their lives are entwined with what happens to the army next, so they want to be involved. And what follows is this very public army assembly, where various generals, like Perdiccas, like Ptolemy, another figure called Nearchus, and so on and so forth, they put forward their own proposals as what they think should happen next, and they're trying to get the support of the soldiers. If they get the support of the soldiers, that means that they can almost kind of go ahead with their plan. That's their aim, at least. It gets a bit more complicated, but let's have that as the rough overview. Perdiccas puts forward his suggestion to await the birth of Roxana's child, and if it proves a son, that they install a regency until the son comes of age. Soldiers aren't too happy with that because they want a solution straight away. So they don't want to wait a few more months for Roxana's child to be born. Ptolemy puts forward a new proposal that they have a council instead. That gets some support. Then there's an idea that Perdiccas actually become Alexander's successor. There's a lot of support for that, but Perdiccas does not want that. He doesn't want to be king. He just wants to be regent at the stage, because becoming king at that time was too much of a poisoned chalice. There are too many powerful, prominent figures in the empire who would very much oppose that. So there's all this back and forth. They can't reach a decision. Ultimately, the soldiers rather than the generals take it into their own hands to name their own preferred successor, and they name Alexander the Great's half-brother Aridaeus, and they crown him Philip Aridaeus III as the new Macedonian king, the person that the generals did not want ruling the empire. It results in the generals having to flee Babylon because they refuse to accept the soldiers' choice of this new monarch, Philip Aridaeus III. There's a scuffle in the room where Alexander the Great died, barely 48 hours after Alexander's death. And after that, there's a small siege of Babylon, where the army is divided between the Macedonian infantry in the city, with Philip Aridaeus III and their new leader called Meleager, and generals like Perdiccas and the rest of the royal army outside, laying siege to Babylon. So, Russell, that kind of gives an idea of the chaos that so quickly engulfs just this centre of the Macedonian Empire as soon as Alexander dies. And it's a symbol of the crisis that will start unfolding all across the length and breadth of the empire, the turmoil that will soon occur.
So you're saying within about 48 hours, we're facing some kind of a civil war?
Roughly, within 48 hours is that I say that for by the time that there is a conflict in the room where Alexander's died. So actually Alexander's body is still there, and there is a fight between some of the generals, including Perdiccas and Ptolemy and Python, and their companions, some 600 of them, and the Macedonian veteran infantrymen led by Meleager, who are the Red Mist has descended because they're angry at the generals for not accepting their choice of the new king, Philip Aridaeus III. Ultimately, there is a reconciliation between the two, and then the generals escape to outside of the city, where they lay siege to the city with the rest of the royal army. So yes, there is there, and of course, the Babylon crisis does continue for a bit longer, until finally, in the days following, thanks largely to the efforts of Perdiccas, the two sides do reconcile, and there's a great reconciliation event which turns bloody, but it does end the crisis.
Why is Aridaeus so unsatisfactory to the generals? Because I would have thought he's presumably somebody that needs somebody behind him to sort of pull the strings, so you would have thought that might be quite satisfactory to say somebody like Perdiccas, because he could be the man, no?
You know, that is a great question, and it's a really interesting one, and I'm still thinking about it now, because it was almost as if with Aridaeus, maybe it was a bit of a wild card or something, because the source we have for this is Quintus Curtius Rufus, which basically just says how the generals didn't want Aridaeus as king as their suggestion, because even as you say, he could potentially be controlled, but perhaps because he wasn't one of the proposals put forwards by the generals. He was the proposal put forwards by one of the soldiers, so it wasn't the idea of the generals. That may well have been a contributing factor to it. It is a very interesting one, but ultimately, from the sources that we have available, they did not initially want Philip Aridaeus III as king. Now, as you say, actually, in the long term, because Philip Aridaeus III does have this mental deficiency, and there needs to be someone, whoever becomes regent, basically, for Philip Aridaeus is the new king. This works very well for the figures who eventually become regent, who will ultimately be Perdiccas. But it is interesting why you do have that pushback in the beginning, and it may be, I've been thinking about this as I've been answering it, it may well be because, according to the story, it is because the idea of Philip Aridaeus III is put forwards by one of the soldiers, supposedly an ignotus, someone of no significant rank, who puts forward the suggestion. And perhaps that was the reason why it was so difficult for the generals to accept initially, because it actually wasn't one of their proposals. There might be another reason too, but it is a good point to raise. Why? Because ultimately he is able to be controlled, which will be what the regent of these first 2 years following Alexander's death, and then the regent who follows Perdiccas, will be able to do.
Okay, so let's wind the story forward a bit. Philip Aridaeus is confirmed king, I think, and so then what happens?
So the Babylon crisis ends with a great reconciliation event. Perdiccas is able to he still has this great respect amongst the Macedonian soldiers, many of whom had served alongside him, and they are able to reconcile. Meleager, the infantry leader, in the meantime has, I think it's fair to say, according to the sources, he's lost a lot of confidence. He's not as powerful as he was. They reconcile. Meleager is given a position as Perdiccas' new right-hand man, and Perdiccas is affirmed as basically commander of the army, and Philip Aridaeus is named as king. reconciliation event. They think it's just to kind of reconcile, get everyone together. They march the Macedonian infantry into the center of a plain outside Babylon. But then Perdiccas, he goes forwards with the king by his side. The king is now in Perdiccas' hands, and they take out from the Macedonian rank and file Meleager's chief supporters. They bring them out into the center. Then they bring the Indian war elephants forwards, and they trample all of Meleager's supporters to death in front of everyone to say, hey, we're in charge now. Meleager doesn't last much longer. He's assassinated in a temple in Babylon literally hours after this reconciliation event. So following that, as you say, Philip Aridaeus III is crowned the new king, with also the agreement that following the birth of Alexander the Great's child, if it proves a son, they will also proclaim him king too in time. So the aim is that there will be two kings, but one of them is incapable of ruling without help because of the mental deficiency that he had. The other is an infant. So they need a regent. And Perdiccas, he's the man of the hour in this reconciliation event. Even though it's brutal, he becomes the new regent. He oversees the distribution of the various regions to various figures who are expecting prime postings for their support of Perdiccas in the preceding crisis. So other key generals of Alexander the Great are now given key regions in the empire. Ptolemy is the most interesting. He's already starting to show a bit of animosity, a bit of difficulty. There's a bit of there's not very friendly relations between him and Perdiccas already, but he's given Egypt. He heads a powerful faction, so he demands Egypt. Perdiccas has to give him Egypt. It doesn't seem he has much choice. Python is given Media, so east of the Zagros Mountains. Lysimachus is given Thrace. Peucestus retains Persia. Eumenes of Cardia is given Cappadocia, which wasn't actually conquered at that time, so it's a very difficult posting for him. Laomedon given Syria, and so on and so forth. So Aridaeus is crowned as king. Perdiccas is the regent, so he's basically the man with the power. And beneath Perdiccas in this new pyramid of authority, you have his former brothers in arms, his former comrades like Ptolemy and so forth, who receive governorships across the empire.
And would you say that Ptolemy's got the best governorship, or which is the really choice governorship? Is it Egypt or
Egypt? I would say probably Egypt, because Egypt is very good for several different reasons. One, it has when Ptolemy arrives, there are no real external enemies for him to face. There are no external problems that he has to deal with straight away. He can consolidate. Two, its geographical position is remarkable. It's brilliant, with the River Nile, very fertile. Three, it's very rich. The treasury, which Ptolemy inherits when he murders his second in command, this guy called Cleomenes, who was a very corrupt governor of Egypt during Alexander the Great's lifetime. Something like 8,000 talents, 10,000 talents. So Ptolemy has got the financial and economic and the starts of the military resources to turn Egypt into this great bastion of strength. So he has a prime plum posting where he can kind of form a nucleus of his power and start expanding outwards, which he will ultimately do. He'll particularly look westwards to Cyrenaica. I can't think of any other postings that are as fruitful and as valuable at that time as Egypt. Potentially somewhere like, I was going to say Cilicia, but Cilicia has a lot of trouble at that time. That's like southeastern Turkey, and the same with Syria. Babylonia.
Yeah, Babylonia. Presumably Babylonia is where Perdiccas is?
So Perdiccas, he does stay there at the start, when all these other people go off with their own small armies, which they segment off bits of the royal army and they go to their different provinces. Perdiccas does stay in Babylon for some time, but he ultimately realises that if he's to retain his power, his prominence as regent, then he has to go west, because that's where so many of these other prominent figures are, waging their own campaigns, getting their own glory, and Perdiccas is almost seen as being this man on the periphery. He's not being involved, so actually his authority is dwindling, even though he has control of Alexander the Great's body and of Philip Aridaeus. So Perdiccas stays in Babylon for almost a year, just under a year, before he heads west to get his own great military victory in Asia Minor. But Babylonia is actually, yes, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, which is not ruled by Perdiccas exactly, because Perdiccas is the regent. He's the man overall in charge. The governor of Babylonia is a man called Archon. But that's a very rich, fruitful posting too. Persia too, Media too. They're all very rich postings in that area of the world.
And what about Macedonia itself? Because one of the things that puzzles me about the Macedonian success is where are all these Macedonians coming from? There seem to be tons of them. And you'd think, well, many of them died coming back from India, crossing the desert. 10 years of campaigning, or however long it is, the wear and tear must have been incredible. And yet we just hear about, the Macedonians continued to be successful for year after year after year, and these huge armies are grappling with each other. I just wonder, where are all these people coming from?
Well, there are a few points I think you need to mention there. The first is Alexander the Great crossing the Gedrosian Desert. Yes, he loses a lot of men, but it's most likely lots of people. But it's most likely those who die are those in the baggage train, and so not actually many of his Macedonian soldiers. There's always fun between scholars and academics as to how many Macedonian soldiers were in the Royal Army when Alexander the Great dies. Estimates go as low as some 9,000, I think Brian Bosworth puts forward as the lowest one, but others have gone so far as to suggest it's about 15,000. I kind of rest in that kind of 13,000 mark bracket, and I think that's what Quintus Curtius Rufus says as well. Definitely more than 10,000 soldiers in the Royal Army that Perdiccas has. But you would be forgiven for thinking, where are all these Macedonian soldiers coming from? All of these clashes occurring all across Alexander's empire following his death. Well, I think that's where we need to remember the significance in this period of the soldiers that aren't mentioned, and you just hear the Macedonian soldiers. And by that I mean the countless thousands of mercenaries that are hired by Alexander and his successors in this period, and also the significant number of Oriental and Asian troops, levies and so forth, that are raised in the meantime too. Some trained in the Macedonian manner, others trained in their more standard professions local to their particular regions, like javelin-armed horsemen from Cappadocia, for instance, and so on and so forth. So the Macedonian soldiers are very, very interesting because you have some significant groups of them between 323 and 320. One of the significant groups being with Perdiccas in the Royal Army, but another being back in Macedonia with Antipater, the viceroy of Macedonia, this 70-year-old general who had been the governor of Macedonia since Alexander the Great left Europe. And then you get small contingents of Macedonians serving with other generals, sometimes as the personal bodyguard, sometimes as a small battalion of infantry on special missions. But largely, many of these generals who are now going off to their new positions, such as Ptolemy in Egypt or Lysimachus in Thrace, they almost certainly don't have any Macedonian soldiers or a significant batch of Macedonian soldiers with them. Instead, they'll have lots of mercenaries. They'll have other ethnic battalions, regiments with them, and it's up to them to then hire more and more and more.
So you hinted that pretty much everywhere except Egypt have tons of external enemies. So I don't know how much we want to get into that because it's sort of an endless story, even at this stage. But is it worth saying a little bit about?
I think just to highlight the geographic scale of it is very interesting to see. And so you've got, within like 6 months of Alexander's death, you've got the outbreak of this big revolt in Greece, in mainland Greece, led by the city-state of Athens. This is the war called the Lamian War, the Hellenic Revolt, which takes Antipater, the Macedonian governor of Macedonia. It takes him more than a year, well, yes, just over a year to actually quash and to put a new constitution on the Athenians. At the same time, you have more than 20,000 veteran Hellenic mercenaries revolting from their postings in the distant northeastern frontier of the empire, modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, and trying to get home back to Greece once they hear that Alexander the Great had died. In Thrace, you have Lysimachus, who has to fight against an army of some 28,000 men, and he only has 6,000 according to the sources, led by a local Odrysian Thracian king called Seuthes III, and they have some titanic clashes. In Asia Minor, you have an Iranian warlord called Ariarathes, who is able to raise an army of more than 50,000 soldiers, and is basically this great Iranian independent warlord who is just hovering on the edges of the Macedonian territory. Is supposedly part of the Macedonian Empire. Eumenes is the supposed new governor of it, but he's got to win it back from Ariarathes. And that's basically Perdiccas' Gaugamela when he has to go there and fight Ariarathes in this huge clash. But
which he wins?
Which he does win. Yes, absolutely, which he does win. But so that's kind of the example of all across the empire, in 323 BC, end of 323 BC, and into 322, you have these various external threats, which various figures, Perdiccas, Lysimachus, Antipater, Python, have to deal with.
When I read your book, I thought the Greeks My understanding had been that the Greeks had stood no chance against these sort of hardened Macedonian troops, but when I read your book, it seemed like it was a closer run thing than I had thought. So what's your take on that? Could Athens have won that war with a bit of luck, or was it doomed from the start?
It's a great question. It's always really difficult doing the what if
Yeah.
scenarios. A really interesting quote from the Lamian War is basically the Athenians have a very sizable army at this time. They've rebuilt their military strength on land and at sea, and they have lots of money, so they hire lots of veteran mercenary soldiers too. So they do have like a very significant military force when Alexander the Great dies, and they have allies. And sometimes with these things, it's all about momentum. And what's the difficulty for the Athenians is that although they had strength in numbers at the start, they had a navy, almost 400 ships. The problem is they didn't have really any depth in reserves. So there's a great statement by Phocion, this statesman of Athens, when he's doubtful of this war against the Macedonians, and one of his friends takes him out to show him these mercenaries walking through the streets of Athens, how great the Athenians look with all their polished armour and their fine spears and shields and so forth. And they say, come on, Phocion, admit you're wrong now. Look at this. This is great. We've definitely got a chance. And Phocion basically says along the lines of, yes, but where are the reserves? Kind of thing like that. And he's right. Athens was committing all of its power from the start. And it works well for them at the start. They defeat Antipater. They start really well, and they gain more and more allies, and it looks like they're gaining momentum and potentially could strike at the Macedonian heartlands. But ultimately, you have these other figures, Macedonian figures, who come to the aid of Antipater and his soldiers in Macedonia. So you see this great cavalry. The cavalry arrives from the east with these Macedonian generals coming with their own armies, and ultimately that proves too much. Because the Athenian fleet, although they had 400 ships, they didn't have the manpower to man all of the ships. So they only could field, I think, at Amorgos, which is the great climactic naval battle, which is often overlooked, but is basically the but like the swan song of Athenian naval prowess. The Athenians aren't able to fit as many ships as they'd like, and they're defeated by the Macedonians. And as soon as the Athenians lose thalassocracy, control of the sea, then they are unable to blockade the Macedonians coming back from Asia to help. And so as soon as that happens, it's a ticking clock for the Athenians, because more and more Macedonians will come and the Athenians will gradually be worn down. So if they had won that naval battle at Amorgos and defeated their prime Macedonian navy, yes, potentially the Athenians could have won that war, but we will never know because they lost.
That's the what if school of history. And the Macedonians, I was very struck by how vindictive they were to the leaders of the rebellion. How did it end for them?
Well, the couple who are always isolated, they're always highlighted at the end of the Lamian War, are these two great leaders, which is Hypereides and Demosthenes. Demosthenes, basically the Cicero of classical Hellenistic Athens, the person that Cicero admired the most, thought was this fascinating orator, brilliant speaker. Demosthenes, well, let's talk about Hypereides first. He's often put in the shadow of Demosthenes, basically because he lives at the same time as Demosthenes. Even though he's similarly extraordinary, he can rouse the rabble. He's the leading anti-Macedonian figure at the time of Alexander the Great's death. Hypereides tries to flee Athens when the Macedonians are approaching at the end of the Lamian War and the Athenians have been defeated. He's captured and he's brought to Antipater. And I believe, if I remember correctly, he has his tongue cut out first of all, and then he is killed by Antipater there and then, to kind of basically cut out of Hypereides the thing that had been so damning of Macedonian authority over the previous years. Demosthenes, he escapes to another island, Calauria. He's ultimately pursued and hunted down by this ancient bounty hunter called Archias, and he takes poison. Rather than face the mercy or potentially plead his case in front of Antipater, he takes poison. He doesn't give Antipater satisfaction. Those are the two who are highlighted out. Leosthenes, the great general of the Athenians, has died long before this. Menon, the other great general, survives a bit longer, but he also dies in combat. But Hypereides and Demosthenes are the main ones.
Okay, so while all this has been going on, Perdiccas, presumably he's trying to bolster his position. So how does he try to sort of enforce his power, or I don't quite know how to put it?
Well, there are few ways he has to do this, and it's also important to realise he is noticing these other things that are happening in the meantime. He is noticing that some prominent figures in the empire, like Antigonus, like Ptolemy, are starting to openly defy his orders, his commands, whilst he's still in Babylon. Ptolemy is now waging a war in Cyrenaica. He takes control of Cyrenaica, this wealthy land, which is actually now modern-day Cyrenaica too, and he's murdered his second-in-command, who was seen as more favourable to Perdiccas, Cleomenes. Antigonus refuses to help Perdiccas' ally Eumenes of Cardia in taking control of Cappadocia. So Perdiccas needs to kind of reaffirm his authority because he's seen very much as a peripheral figure by those in the West. So he remakes his presence. He makes his presence known. He comes to the West and he gains a great, significant, major victory against Ariarathes, the Iranian warlord in Anatolia with the royal army. It's basically Perdiccas' Gaugamela, more than, if we can believe the numbers, the size of the royal army, the size of Ariarathes' army. There could have been more than 100,000 combatants on the battlefield for the two battles which Ariarathes and Perdiccas fights, which ultimately leads in Perdiccas winning. And Ariarathes, about 80 years old, and his whole family, apart from one of his sons who escapes, but the rest of his whole family, Perdiccas has executed brutally, being crucified, being impaled, being beheaded. One of those.
It really is out of Game of Thrones, this stage in history. It's not like any other period of ancient history that I can think of for its sheer viciousness.
Well, this is like why you're quite right, and it's one thing that I found so fascinating about it. And one of my missions with this area of ancient history is to share these stories and let people realise the world doesn't end with Alexander the Great's death and then re-emerge with the First Punic War and the rise of Rome. This thing that happens after Alexander's death is even more fascinating, and it actually happened from the sources that we have, so you can piece it together. It is a terrible time to be alive. And like Game of Thrones, there's no good and bad. Everyone has a brutal streak, but everyone sometimes has a more generous streak too. It just depends. It's the realpolitik of the time, trying to survive in this very turbulent time and to pave your own rise, your own power.
But now Perdiccas, he's won his big victories. His stock with the troops must be at an all-time high. What else can he do to sort of establish his authority? Well,
that's key. He wins against Ariarathes, this great victory, and then he wins a punitive campaign against these brigands in Asia Minor too, which adds furthermore to his authority, the respect he has amongst the soldiers. He does a very clever move during it, at least I think it's most credible because of the source material we have surviving, is that he changes the system for that he has control of one king, Philip Aridaeus III. He makes the second king. He officially proclaims Alexander the Great's infant child as king, King Alexander IV. Why is this important? Well, because if Perdiccas is doing that, following his victory, he has the support of the soldiers to do such an act, and all of a sudden, Perdiccas doesn't have control of just one king, he has control of both. And he also has control of the royal army and the finances, and Philip Aridaeus III, well, I mentioned him already, but also Alexander the Great's widow, Roxana, and so on and so forth. So that adds more to his authority. But I think the other thing you're really going to be highlighting at there, Russell, is a marriage alliance. Because this is the other thing that Perdiccas now turns his head to. At the time of Alexander's death, I think it's fair to say that of all of Alexander's generals, there are three figures that stand out above all the rest. And that is on the one hand Perdiccas, who becomes regent, and the other figure of the three is Antipater, the veteran governor of Macedonia, who now, following the Lamian War, the defeat of Athens, is incredibly powerful west of the Dardanelles, of the Hellespont. And a third figure called Craterus, who was this great senior commander of Alexander the Great, on par with Perdiccas, but who wasn't in Babylon when Alexander the Great died. He was with some 9,000 to 10,000 veteran Macedonian soldiers, taking them back to Macedonia. They'd been discharged by Alexander the Great before his death. In the meantime, Antipater and Craterus have formed an alliance. They are worked together in Macedonia to defeat the Athenians, and now they are very much allies, brothers in arms. Craterus has married Antipater's daughter Phyla, so they've secured their own marriage alliance. And Antipater very much wants also to secure an alliance with Perdiccas, so that they form almost a triumvirate, these three prominent figures in the empire. And Perdiccas had been intent on this from the start. He'd offered Antipater a marriage alliance by him marrying another Antipater's daughters called Nicaea. Antipater at the start had been a bit he hadn't been convinced. He'd seen Perdiccas, but he was like, you're in Babylon, you're a bit far away, you're on the periphery. I'm seeing all these others who are kind of defying your authority. I don't actually know how capable a figure you're going to be. But fast forward his victories in Asia Minor, his presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, Antipater is now very keen for this marriage alliance. And Perdiccas, he is presented with Nicaea, Antipater's daughter. It's a tragedy of the time, but that was really the scene of things. Noble daughters were basically just offered to secure marriage alliances in this day and age between these former generals of Alexander the Great. So Nicaea is offered as Perdiccas' wife. She goes to Perdiccas' camp in Anatolia. But Perdiccas then has a conundrum because there is another figure on the scene. And these are two extraordinary royal women, which are Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, and her daughter, Alexander the Great's only full sister, Cleopatra. And Cleopatra and Olympias, it's not to be power behind the throne or anything like that, it's for their own safety, because they know if they don't attach themselves to a prominent general in this turbulent, unstable aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, sooner or later, their blood linked to Alexander the Great means they're going to be used by one of these generals that's now come to the fore. And they're not going to have a say in any of that, or they're going to lose their lives. So they want to attach themselves for their own safety to one of these figures. And at the same time that Nicaea goes to Perdiccas, that Antipater proposes this marriage alliance, Cleopatra also goes to Perdiccas and offers a marriage alliance to her. And with Perdiccas, the chance to link yourself directly to Alexander the Great, to marry into his family, is a very, very tempting offer for someone like Perdiccas. But he ultimately, I'm not gonna. I'll let you intervene here, Russell.
So who does he choose, Nicaea or Cleopatra, which is a name from history?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of Cleopatras. Obviously, this is not the famous Cleopatra, 7th of Egypt, but she's equally astonishing, if not more astonishing, in my opinion.
So why is she so astonishing? Let's just take a little detour there, because that's quite interesting.
Right, why I think she's so astonishing is because she is, as mentioned, she is the full sister of Alexander the Great. And so she forms this mother and daughter team with her mother Olympias in their bid for survival in this very turbulent post-Alexander world. And she first reaches out to Leonatus, who is a figure, one of Alexander's former subordinates, who takes control of a region just next to the Dardanelles following the division of the satrapies of the governorships after the Babylon crisis, but then goes and gets himself killed in the Lamian War, coming to Antipater's aid. He's one of these, he leads from the front and it doesn't work out for him. He dies. So Cleopatra, their first powerful warlord they wanted to align themselves to, it doesn't pay off. But they keep going. And Cleopatra, she acts on the road. She goes to Sardis, which is in Asia Minor. Olympias stays in Macedonia. And from there she stays, maintaining contact first with Perdiccas, but also Perdiccas' adjutant Eumenes, to try and seal this agreement with Perdiccas. And to an extent it succeeds, because although Perdiccas does agree to marry Nicaea, he only plans to marry Nicaea for the short term. His ultimate aim is to get rid of Nicaea, to shun Nicaea when he's strong enough, and to marry Cleopatra and become Alexander's true successor. So he's hedging his bets here, but he wants to keep Antipater on side for the meantime. Where Cleopatra's story gets even more interesting is in the years following this, and this is kind of the area that I'm researching at the moment, is when she has to try and survive in this post-Alexander world, where various figures are now trying to use her or stop her being used by other figures, and whether she can leave Sardis or not. And it's quite a tragic story.
So Perdiccas does marry Nicaea. That's great. He's now super powerful and he's got 2 new allies, and it's hard to see what exactly could go wrong from here for him.
Yes, you say that. the issues, they do come because Cleopatra stays in Sardis, and Perdiccas is actually still corresponding with Cleopatra, although officially marrying Nicaea, agreeing to marry Nicaea, and rumours start going about, because Perdiccas, whilst he's there, he draws, he's not on good terms with Antigonus, who I mentioned earlier. Antigonus, take a step back quickly, because I know that's another name I've just thrown into the fold. He is a veteran general like Antipater. He had served with Alexander the Great's father, Philip II. He had also served with Alexander the Great during the start of Alexander's campaign against the Persian Empire, but he'd been left in central Anatolia when Alexander continued going east and would ultimately conquer the Persian Empire. And Antigonus has been governor of Phrygia for the past 10 years or so, and he has a very solid position there. But he refuses to obey Perdiccas' authority. He refused to help Eumenes in the fight against Ariarathes earlier on. And Perdiccas remembers this. And when he defeats Ariarathes after his victories, and he's in Asia Minor, Anatolia, he's next to Antigonus' satrapy, he demands that Antigonus come to the court to face trial for not abiding by the orders, not of Perdiccas, but of the kings. Because what Perdiccas says are the orders of the kings. So Antigonus has defied the kings by refusing to help Eumenes earlier. And basically it would have been a sham trial, and Antigonus would have either been removed or most likely executed by Perdiccas. Antigonus knows this. He delays, and rather than going to Perdiccas' camp, he flees westwards with an aim to to link up with Antipater in Europe. And on the way he stops at Sardis, where he hears from the local governor, a man called Menander, who is more loyal to Antigonus than to Perdiccas, that there are rumours that Cleopatra and Perdiccas have maintained correspondence. So there are these rumours flowing about that actually, what's he up to here? What is he up to here? Why is he still talking with Cleopatra? Why has Cleopatra remained here rather than going back to Macedonia once he's married Nicaea? And so Antigonus sees this as gold dust that he can use against Perdiccas, because he's determined. Antigonus is determined to destroy Perdiccas' authority, this man who he now hates, because he's got rid of his position in Phrygia. So Antigonus goes across to Europe, where Antipater, Craterus, and their large army are now fighting against these Aetolians, this group of Greeks, Hellenic peoples in the northwest of Greece today, these rugged, they're portrayed as rugged montane people, but they had an Aetolian league, but they were also capable of fighting in the highlands, and they deal a lot of trouble to Antipater during that campaign. And in the midst of that campaign, Antigonus arrives and lets them know that there is this potential, Cleopatra is still talking with Perdiccas, and whether that potentially means that he spreads a rumour that Perdiccas has intentions to discard Nicaea and to marry Cleopatra instead. These royal intentions of Perdiccas aren't helped by the fact that also in the meantime, Perdiccas has, on his authority, although it was his brother who did it, assassinated, murdered a close relative of Alexander the Great, which is his half-sister, Alexander the Great's half-sister, this bellicose warrior woman called Cannae. All of this combines to make Antipater very worried by the news that Antigonus brings, that Perdiccas has killed this close relative of Alexander the Great who was threatening his authority because Cannae wanted to put her daughter as Philip Aridaeus' wife, thus eroding Perdiccas' power as regent by having this wife figure. And this wife, although her name is Aedia Eurydice, although she was only in her teens, she was a very strong-willed woman. She was half Illyrian, half Macedonian. She was following in her mother's footsteps, this very audacious, bold woman. The fact that Perdiccas went to such an end as to have Cannae murdered, combined with the fact that he is still talking with Cleopatra, alarms Antipater and Craterus that Perdiccas has no intent of retaining this triumvirate which they've created between the three of them, and instead has ultimate intentions to seize the throne of Macedon. And that's where it starts crumbling.
Perdiccas, he's got the marriage alliance in mind, he's got the two kings, and actually he's got three kings because he has the body of Alexander the Great. So again, it feels like he's in an unassailable position, no?
He's at the peak of his power at the moment, even after murdering Cannae, which is a terrible move by him. The soldiers are incredibly angry about that, and they insist that they have Cannae's daughter Aedia marry Philip Aridaeus III. So it backfires for Perdiccas because Aedia is now Aridaeus' king. But for the meantime, Aedia, or Eurydice, the daughter of Cleopatra, is still very young, so she doesn't have much of a voice, and Perdiccas is strong enough to retain his overarching authority over the kings and the royal army at this time. Despite that, and despite the worries of Antipater and Craterus in Europe, thanks to the rumour-mongering of Antigonus on his arrival, he's still in an incredibly powerful position because, as you say, he also has control of Alexander the Great's body. And two key symbols of legitimacy for those seeking power in this immediate post-Alexander world. One of them was control of the kings, the other was control of Alexander's body, because Alexander is already this divine-like figure. Whoever controls his body held great sway in the empire. And Perdiccas knows that if he can retain control of Alexander the Great's body, which he does now, if he can oversee its burial, then that's also another key element, key piece of propaganda, of publicity, which will further legitimize his position as the true successor of Alexander the Great. Alexander's body is in Babylon at this moment in time, but it is still officially in Perdiccas' control. And this is where things get interesting.
I get a bit muddled with the chronology. Craterus and Antigonus are sort of now Perdiccas' enemies. Ptolemy, I guess, is Perdiccas' enemy. Well, is he? How does Ptolemy come into this here?
Well, let's not say enemies yet, because war hasn't broken out yet. Antipater and Craterus are getting anxious at Perdiccas because of the rumours that they've heard that have been spiced up by Antigonus. So they're wary and they're looking at that. And they're also now in cahoots with Ptolemy. Ptolemy is not very friendly to Perdiccas at this moment in time, because Ptolemy has done a number of acts to expand his control in Egypt and to remove Perdiccas' influence at Ptolemy's court at Memphis, the ancient Egyptian city of Memphis. Alexandria is not built yet. It's not Ptolemy's capital at the moment. Ptolemy is making these acts, which is very much, he's making it clear to Perdiccas that he's not willing to abide by his authority. So there are these acts of dissidence happening, and there's this clear animosity emerging between Perdiccas and Ptolemy, and Perdiccas has already got one eye on Egypt, on removing Ptolemy in the near future. Ptolemy is already preparing for it by improving the defences along the River Nile and so on and so forth, in case of a potential attack by Perdiccas. So although, let's say the chronology now is mid to late 321 BC, so almost 2 years after Alexander's death, Perdiccas is in Anatolia, Antipater and Craterus, they're in Europe, Ptolemy's in Egypt, and the body's in Babylonia, in Babylon. There's no war yet, but tensions rising.
I think that's a great point to end today's podcast, and people can find out what happens next week. Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favour to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible, because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.